right, so today I want to talk about MCP and everything that API providers really need to know about this new standard that has emerged over the last year. By a show of hands, is anyone familiar with MCP in this room? Okay, wow, that's actually more than I anticipated. That very interesting. So it stands for Model Context Protocol. It was open sourced by Anthropic in November of last year. So that's why we didn't touch on it last year in last year's Platform Summit, because it's brand new. It's emerged with a lot of exciting opinions. I think it's exciting news for APIs. It's this proposed standard for connecting AI agents with internal or external tools and data. And many think that it could act as this universal bridge between AI agents and APIs. Really, it makes the developer experience of integrating with APIs incredibly convenient because it's like a simple configuration to add an MCP server into an AI coding environment. And ultimately, this could possibly increase the use of APIs considerably. So we've seen an MCP mania emerge in the API community and in the AI and tech community at large. I'm a tech journalist. I see the PRs about MCP all the time coming into my inbox. It's featured heavily in new releases, and enterprises seem to be going all in on this new standard. But it can kind of seem like there's a lot of noise about this right now. It almost seems like Beatlemania from the 60s, and it's hard to know what is just hype versus what is an actual purpose-built implementation that's going to deliver tangible value at the end of the day. So in this presentation, I'd like to take an unbiased look at MCP. I want to discover what it is, what it can be used for, look at some emerging best practices that API providers can consider if they're thinking about embracing MCP and launching an MCP server, and briefly look at some benefits and drawbacks, and hopefully leave you with some recommendations on what the heck to do with this thing. But I don't want to go there quite yet. I want to first talk about that second word, context. Context is incredibly important for so many things that we do in our daily lives. Context is incredibly important if you want to know why a friend might be feeling sad. You need context into what's been going wrong in their life. You need context if you're going into a boardroom meeting. You don't want to spout just random financial information, right? You want context into what's been happening in the business. Context can be defined as the conditions in which something exists or occurs. It's the facts and opinions relating to a thing or an event. It's the reason why when I say API, you know what I'm talking about. If your context was completely different, like if you were working in the pharmaceuticals industry, for example, API would mean something much different in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredient. Or if you're, if you care about air pollution, you might think of it as air pollution index. So context can lead to silly mix-ups like this. But a lack of context can lead to more disastrous implications. Just take in 1999, NASA lost a $125 million Mars orbiter due to a lack of a shared context. Essentially, the engineers were calculating the re-entry, and they were using imperial units in one developer group and then metric units in another set of engineering group. And of course, it blew up upon re-entry. So they totally lost it because of this lack of shared context. Most famously, a lack of context led to this man, Hiro Onoda, hiding in the jungle for literally 30 years because he never knew that World War II had ended. He was part of the Japanese military forces in this island in the Philippines, and due to a lack of context, he thought the World War II had never ended, and so he just kind of stayed in there doing funny guerrilla tactics for a long time until his direct commanding officer finally came and relieved him in person. So yeah, a lack of context can lead to some pretty disastrous effects and confusing implications. So that got me thinking, what if AI lacked context? What if AI didn't realize we were using metric instead of imperial units of measurement? What if it didn't realize an entire war had ended? What if it was something more benign, like we have a lack of context into, shared principles within our development organization, or shared style guides and documentation? Well, it would probably fall flat, right? I think it's my opinion, without a lack of context, without a lack with the lack of integration to internal and external APIs and relevant data, AI and agentic AI and all this great stuff we're talking about in the industry right now, it's all going to fall flat. We need access to relevant information on the fly in order to make this whole future of autonomous AI really work. And a lot of executives in the tech industry are saying this right now. They're realizing the importance of APIs. As Doug Gilbert, CIO and CDO of Sutherland Global, told me for a story for CIO.com, we see APIs as the cornerstone of agentic AI. So a lot of tech leadership are coming to the conclusion that APIs are really important to support AI agents. Others see them as necessary for system integration. Like Rebecca Fox, Group CIO at cybersecurity consultancy NCC Group, told me, APIs are the glue. Without them, agentic AI can't effectively combine or orchestrate processes across different systems. So more and more people are coming to the realization that APIs are incredibly important to enable this whole agentic future. And that's great, right? But standards really matter here. The standard by which AI agents are integrating with external data sources and services and tools, that really matters, because I don't want to live in the future just like with my USB cords, where we have this terrible present day adapter situation. And yeah, they said USB-C was going to be the penultimate result of it all, but I still find myself using all these different adapters. I don't want that to be the case with software and AI. So that brings us to MCP, back to MCP. People are talking about MCP as this universal AI integration layer, just as USB-C is apparently the end-all be-all universal connector standard. MCP is supposedly supposed to be that universal connector for AI. But what exactly is it? Well, it's an open protocol that enables seamless integration between large language models, LLMs, their applications, and external data sources and tools. This is how the GitHub repo for MCP defines itself. And I said that to my wife in this presentation, bless her heart for listening, and she was like, what does that mean? So to put it a different way, it's an open source specification that specifies how a MCP client connects to an MCP server, which might be local or remotely installed. And that server exposes itself in terms of tools, which the AI coding environment has a list of and can choose at runtime. And those tools are abstracting API calls under the hood. That's still a technical way to describe it, but it's kind of a technical thing. MCP fits into the rise of AI agents pretty well. Like I said, we have this huge surge in AI-powered coding agents. People are using tools like Copilot or Windsurf or Cursor to kind of vibe code their way across different features lately. Like, they're literally doing this whole natural language engineering. And this whole best practices have emerged around prompt engineering. But we're seeing some limitations with large language models because they only know so much. They only know what they have been trained upon. And in order to really give them hands into the real world, we need to connect them with external data sources and APIs. So that's why MCP kind of fits into this momentum that we've been noticing lately. This is a very reductive diagram, but just to show how MCP fits into the modern AI-powered development workflow. Essentially, you have an AI coding environment, like I said, which is powered by a large language model, whether it's OpenAI's GPT-4 or Claude or Gemini. And that's able to see a list of MCP tools, which essentially connects to backend APIs. This does not consider identity and access management or the security and authorization side of things at all. Just a very conceptual overview of what's happening. I think why MCP has surged in interest lately, it really comes down to convenience. It's incredibly easy to set up. For example, if you want to interact with the Stripe MCP server with Cursor, you simply just add this to your mcp.json file, which is just a configuration of different MCP servers that Cursor, the AI coding environment, can access. And you go through your typical authorization, and then boom, you have connection to Stripe. Foregoing all of the API integration best practices and trials that developers typically go through. This is incredibly convenient. So I want to now look at some ways in which MCP can be used for tangible value. Well, like I said, it kind of gives large language models hands to go out and do things in the real world. For example, you could be retrieving local files and adding that for context engineering when you're developing new features. Or you could analyze and interact with GitHub repositories, perform commands on Docker operations. The list goes on, and this was from an article that we put on Nordic APIs, analyzing new MCP servers and their capabilities. You could add new search capabilities and even create cloud databases. There's MCP servers for generating SDKs, even mocking APIs, and the list goes on and on and on. So let's go into some specific examples. This is an example using GitLab's MCP server, and they are a popular DevOps tool for continuous integration and continuous delivery. And you can just use natural English language to say list all failed jobs and pipeline 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a specific project, and it'll do that following that command. Here's another example. I interviewed the CTO from Multiplayer recently, and they just put out an MCP server. And essentially, this application, it records user sessions. So whatever users are doing in the browser, it'll record all those events and then expose that data to developers. So they've found that their developer users are using their MCP server to quickly add session recordings to give their coding environments more context into what they need to do to fix bugs, and even provide a step-by-step debugging plan and suggesting code changes. So they'll use that information through the MCP server when they're talking to their AI agents. And this uses tools like get session by ID, get session notes by session ID, and some others that Multiplayer has exposed through their MCP server. Another final example, and this one is more on the business user side of things. Let's consider a financial AI agent. This is a theoretical example. But using Stripe MCP server, you could use tools like retrieve balance or create invoice and access certain customer parameters. Using simple natural language commands, an end user could say something like retrieve account balance for customer yada 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 and generate a new invoice matching this amount. And a financial AI agent that is connected through MCP that Stripe exposes could actually process that command. So all this is technically feasible. There's some other examples, like we could consider what we could do with GitHub's MCP server. That's one of the more popular ones right now. It could be used, for inspecting runs and jobs, surfacing new security alerts, and even opening pull requests and more. And the list goes on and on. There are many popular APIs out there that have launched official MCP servers. I've mentioned Stripe, I've mentioned GitHub, but Twilio, Box, Notion, Redis, Slack, and more. They're all investigating MCP right now. And we've seen this huge trend toward MCP development at large. Like I said, it's only been open source since November 2024. But since that time, we've seen 17,000 MCP servers come to market. That's what one directory lists it as. All the major AI coding assistants, like nearly all of them, they're on board with MCP and supporting it. And we keep seeing it, like I said, in front and center of new feature releases and such. So if you're an API provider in the room, you might be pretty interested in this. You know, like, should we be hopping on the MCP bandwagon, if you will, right now? Well, it takes more than just checking that MCP box. As one person that has gone through the ringer of launching an MCP server told me, there are a lot of bad MCP servers out there just collecting dust. So that large number of 17,000 might be a little bit inflated in terms of actual usage. So how do we avoid this inevitability? How do we avoid an MCP server ghost town? Well, thankfully, we're already starting to see some emerging best practices on how API providers can wrap their tools and APIs effectively for MCP. The first one that I see very frequently discussed is you should not be modeling your entire API one-to-one if you're creating MCP tools. This is kind of the running best practice lately. You want to scope what MCP has access to, and an API, you know, could have hundreds or thousands of methods, and giving all of that to a large language model and expecting it to understand all that can lead to a lot of confusion. Having trouble with this clicker. Because when you're designing MCP tools, less is more. As Kun Chen, lead principal engineer at Atlassian, told me, simply wrapping an existing REST API into MCP tools often result in AI agents struggling to use them effectively. And this is because of the idea of indeterminism. We don't really know what large language models are going to do. This is the reason why you might ask ChatGPT one thing one day and ask it the same thing the next day, and you'll get completely different results. This is just how large language models are constructed to behave. It's hard to have them perform in a predictable way each time. So if they have access to a lot of different APIs, especially with sensitive, mutable capabilities, things could go wrong without the right guardrails. So that's why the running idea right now is just to start testing this out with a few read-only actions. For example, I mentioned Stripe earlier, right? Well, I looked at their MCP tools, and they're only exposing about 25 read-only or list-oriented methods. So they're just retrieving information for the most part with GET calls through these MCP tools. Their raw API has about 120 top-level resources, and the MCP server is, you know, safely leaving out things like sensitive API endpoints, you know, such as the charges endpoint or post to payouts or resolving a dispute. And I've noticed this trend in a handful of official MCP servers that are testing their implementations currently. You know, they're just seeing how this works, experimenting with how developers use it with just a few read-only actions. Also, another best practice I've noticed is designing use case-driven MCP tools that model natural language. Because that's how large language models were trained, right? They were trained on natural language. So the naming we use in describing MCP actually matters and can help large language models know what to use at runtime. As Toby Padilla, principal product manager at GitHub, told me for an article recently, match your tool names and descriptions as closely as possible to how people speak. So one little nugget to keep in mind if you're designing things for MCP. Another idea is automatically generating MCP. There are plenty of tools emerging out there on the market for generating MCP servers. I'm not going to tell you which ones to use or which API management provider is the best that handles this. Go look at it for yourself. But the end fact of the day is that API drift is such a common thing. And if we're abstracting that another level with MCP, when the API changes, yeah, the server is going to change that's associated with it. So having some sort of source of truth that's connected to how we continually update MCP, I think is going to be important going forward. Another thing is just getting the word out about MCP servers. Like I said, there's 17,000 out there now. Well, when programmable web, the famous directory of APIs, when that was shuttered in 2022, I believe there was about 25,000 APIs listed. So we're nearing that amount just with MCP servers. So getting the word out about your server could be challenging now that there's these competing tools out there. So there's emerging registries and directories where you could list your server and hopefully get it in front of more developers who are searching for these kind of things. This includes like the official MCP registry that Anthropic created, or I should say the MCP open source community created. And they actually released an API recently, so full circle. There's also the GitHub MCP registry, mcp.so, and the list goes on. We've reviewed some of these on the blog recently. I should talk about the drawbacks briefly. We're going to dig into this in this conference quite a bit. There's even a track dedicated to MCP security. There have been a number of security exploits discovered. One research group called Invariant Labs, they found some tool poisoning attacks are possible in MCP ecosystems. And another study found that 43% of MCP servers contain command injection flaws. So there's a lot of insecure development happening with MCP, as it turns out. Really, keeping things safe, keeping things secure matters a ton here, and all your standard API security best practices still apply. The official MCP servers I've noticed that are doing this correct, they're still using OAuth, they're using dynamic client registration for client apps, but this scratches the surface. There's plenty more tips, and we'll dive into this in this conference as well. Another thing, MCP, it's flashy, right? It's the shiny new thing right now. And there are other competing agent to API protocols out there. It's not the only one. That's one drawback. We don't really know where this is going to land. Hopefully, I'll have a better answer for you next year on the stage. Also, I've noticed a lot of developers talking about this new configuration chaos. We have AI agents and their configurations to MCP servers, and now we're juggling all the updates of all of that. So it can complicate things, really, if you're not taking a managed approach to it. I should point out, using AI willy-nilly causes a lot of waste, and it has some, unsavory environmental effects. Really, MCP is it shouldn't be viewed as a replacement for everything, too. I put together an article for the New Stack recently where I looked at, when does MCP make sense versus when it doesn't. And the emerging consensus was that, for predictable automation, when context remains relatively static, if you're like sidestepping established CLIs, MCP doesn't really make much sense. But if you have these novel agentic workflows, you're doing a lot of stuff on the fly, you're providing new engineering contexts, like perhaps that multiplayer example that I had referenced earlier, something like that. Or when no standard integration exists, it can benefit things. Really, it's a convenience. It's automating a lot of the developer experience that we're used to with hard coding API integrations. Like I said, that's a big positive here. If you want to try MCP, another benefit would be, hey, you're experimenting with a new platform. Just as APIs were a new platform, I tend to view MCP servers as a new platform. You don't really know how developers are going to use it or how they're going to integrate it into their daily workflows until you release this and start experimenting with it. Hopefully, at the end of the day, this could increase API usage and end monetization. And the security around it is improving. There are people contributing back to the open source community that is established around MCP. And really, I think this fits into the overall growth we're seeing in retrieval augmented generation bot scraping. I think a study found from late 2024 to early 2025, they noticed a nearly 50% increase in this activity on websites. And that was faster than AI training bots. So to me, this shows that instead of completely updating the underlying model, a lot of these AI tools, they're grabbing a lot of information on the fly for new contexts in the moment. And I think APIs and API integrations will continue to emerge. We'll continue to see AI agents calling APIs more and more. So prepare for the agents. That would be my recommendation now. Unfortunately, developers are sort of ill-equipped or not really preparing for this currently. This is very fresh data. This is from Postman's State of the API report, which just came out, I think, last week. So they found that only 24% of developers are actively designing APIs with agentic AI consumption in mind. So people know about this, but they're not really actively doing it quite yet. On that point, kind of like what we saw earlier in this room, 2/3 of developers are already aware of MCP, but reality sets in. Only 10% of them are actively using it. So it's such a new thing, such a new protocol. It's just very untested at this point. So in summary, MCP, interesting new standard. It's shaken up the AI community and inspired a lot of people in the API community over the last year. A lot of people are viewing it as a force multiplier for developer productivity due to its extreme convenience. And I think API providers should evaluate, and consider if it makes sense for you, but use caution and continually follow some of the best practices and model those use cases that I talked about earlier. I think it makes sense for more like public-facing API products, or maybe APIs that are accessing or being used by developers for like DevOps capabilities. I think that makes a lot of sense for MCP servers that can like integrate into a developer's workflow. So it won't really hurt to at least try it and see how it goes. A lot of people are viewing this rush toward MCP as like the new gold rush. One person even compares it to, the SE gold rush of the .com boom. So like what Jeffrey Wang told me, today the app providers standing up MCP servers will be the ones dominating agentic search and orchestration flows over the next few years. So a lot of people making some pretty bullish claims on MCP. I'm not going to go through this all right now at all, but I just want to say like being machine readable and having your API prepared for agentic consumption, there's a lot more that goes into that, just excluding MCP. So yeah, take a picture of this, or check out what we're writing on Nordic APIs to learn more about how to prepare your AI agent. Prepare your API for AI agent consumption. That's kind of all I have to say. I'll just leave you on the note of have the right context. Don't get lost in the jungle for 30 years experimenting with MCP. I think context matters for humans, AI, and API providers need it as well. Thank you.